next talk. The title of the talk is 250 Years of Shops and Trades in Hackney's Historic High Street, and this is not only a talk, it's the worldwide launch of the accompanying book. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Carolyn.
Thank you, and after that I think I would say hello world. Can I say that this is a book produced by myself and Alison, who's over the other side of the piano. And at the time we wrote the blurb, it was going to be 250 years, it's actually gone up to 300, so there's inflation for you. So the book sort of covers 1670s to the 1970s. So I'm going to start, and the book is all about the development of shops and trades over that time. And we've chosen Central Hackney because that really was a centre of shopping and shops for North East London. And as I go through it, you'll see what I mean. But one of the reasons that Central Hackney was what became that is because it started off as a large and populous village with very wealthy people in there. And the quote at the time was nearly 100 gentlemen's coaches kept. Now what I'd say is 100 gentlemen's coaches means over 100 grooms, over 100 stable boys, over 100 servants. So in fact that represents a great deal of people who all needed to be clothed and fed and supplied by the various trades. And of course there were also then the builders to build all the stables and the properties. So that's 1745, the map, and you'll see ribbon developments all along what was then Church Street. Just to avoid confusion, Church Street was Church Street until 1868, when it merged with Mare Street, and so then it becomes Mare Street. So I will sometimes say Church Street and sometimes say Mare Street, but it's all the same street. So to move on to 1850, one of the biggest changes in Central Hackney was when the railways arrived. Suddenly there was a lot more development. It became a 10-minute commute into the city rather than maybe a good hour on rotten roads. And very soon the area began to blossom with building. And of course that change was also in terms of people. You began to get the middle classes moving into Hackney, and of course the working classes as well, and that changed not just the number of people but also the balance of population. And this is an overhead photo from 1958, and you'll see by this time the whole area has been developed. The only difference is that you can see the railway line right across the middle almost. And of course, to the right, below it, where Tesco's is now, that was bombed during the war, and that's prefabs you can see there. But basically, the shopping street goes right up the centre. I put little red arrows, just in case you can't spot it. And that was, at the time, a very thriving street. In terms of the impact of the changes, those are the population figures for that period, and you'll see the wallop in size after the railway arrived, and then again by the turn of the 20th century you get a very large number of people, and these people all would need to be clothed and fed, etc. So to go on to the trades that were around. Now this is the earliest ones, this is all Alison's work, I've got to say, from 1831. And you can see the number of trades there were locally, which more or less could, the Mare Street or Church Street could meet virtually every local need. And you can see the breakdown there. Today the book covers all of these, but we won't be able to cover them all today, so I've selected some which I think show the major changes. At that time there were very few shops as such. A lot of the trading, certainly in Georgian times, the early Victorian times, a lot of trading took place in front rooms. But there were some shops. And there were some very specialist shops. There were, for example, a breeches maker that was definitely served the wealthy. There was also, you'll see, tallow chandler, and tallow chandlers basically made candles, and they became extremely wealthy. In fact, one of them, Twistle, has got his trade coin in the British Museum. And they would have made them out of tallow, which actually stank, basically is animal fat, or for the very wealthy, they'd have had the luxury of beeswax. But that was a very important trade. But you'll see virtually everything was covered in that list, covering all local needs. And a lot of the traders actually were quite good at multitasking. So the tallow chandler I've just mentioned also made soap. But I'm just going to now focus on two particular people we've picked out of a number of traders, just to show that things weren't as simple as they looked like. So Merchant Buck, he was around in the sort of 1780s, and he was a builder and a carpenter. He also sold coal. He also dealt with removed rubbish and also indulged in night soil, which is a very profitable trade at the time. And then, if that wasn't enough, he also did funerals. And there were a set of cottages that were called Bucks Buildings. Has a nice ring to it in Hackney that we think were probably his, although we haven't got actual evidence for that. So that was very early. People were taking on more than one role. And this is another favourite, Mr. Dove, the hatter. This was later, this was 1872. And you can see he had with the, I think that's meant to be Noah's Ark, I think. I'm not altogether sure. But you can see he dealt with everything for inclement weather. So Mr. Dove in the Victorian era was both a hatter, probably as the main trade, but he also dealt in umbrellas and parasols. And then as a sideline, you'll also see up there it says funerals performed. And I'm going to move on now to one of the most notable trades, again, which has a funeral side. I mean, I'm not normally this grim, but we did find a lot of emphasis on funerals. So, I'm going to focus on a trade that was key to the development of the area as a shop and shopping street. And this is the draper's story. So before the 1800s, the only draper that we could find in Church Street was James McGill. As the chart showed, by 1831, there were 5 drapers in Church Street, one of whom was called Green. And you can see the green with the awning on that side. That was Green's, the drapers. By 1940s, there were 8 drapers' shops. Now, draperies were absolutely essential before. Ooh.
If you could move that way, because this camera.
Sorry.
Let me move you. There you go.
Oh, if you move, yes, good cunning plan. Thank you. What was I saying? Yes, I was saying. Up to about 1850, every single garment or piece of houseware that was material was hand sewn, often by servants or the dressmaker if you were very wealthy, or else you had to do it yourself. And of course, there was underlying all this, there was a huge trade in second and third hand goods for the poor. And drapers provided the means to make those goods, so they provided all the materials, including all the haberdashery, to serve that need. They also, because of that, they became arbiters of taste and fashion, and also etiquette. And one of the big trades for drapers was, guess it, the mourning trade. And it was called the mourning trade because there was a very strict, certainly Victorian era etiquette, where both wealthy houses and including all the servants were expected to wear black when there was a death in the family, and that included even deaths of the royal family and things. So that was a major source of income to drapers, and it was certainly one that they wanted to develop and promote. The other thing about the drapers' shops in those early days was there were no prices on stuff, so they used to judge who came into the shop by what they should pay. We'll talk about that in a minute. So Green, this is Green's first draper shop. They were joined by a man called Branscombe, and after a while Branscombe took over the whole business. And this is an 1880 photo, and you can see the railway bridge, so we know where we are, very handy tip. And on the left, on the corner, you had a wine merchant's. Then next to it you had Ely and Wilmore, I think, who were drapers. But the building that is very familiar today with the two turrets and the building beyond, going down to the railway, was all Branscombe's drapery. And of course he had a number of staff, assistants and apprentices who lived in. So above the shop, that would be where they were all sleeping. Now at this time, the apprentice system, from extremely early on, was absolutely essential for the trades to continue, for people to learn the trades, but also for the traders to have a source of very willing, compliant and largely free people to work in the shops. People had to pay a premium to become an apprentice, and then they often only got, for 7 years while they were training, they often only got bed and board and maybe a little bit of pocket money. On the other hand, it gave people the skill to go on to develop their own businesses. In the book, we've got a fantastic quote from H.G. Wells, who himself had trained very unhappily as a draper, and he explains how actually hard, physically hard the work was. You had these great bales of cloth, and you used to have to make sure they were in good condition, and you used to have to take them down, show them to the customer, fold them up, put them back, endlessly, sometimes showing about 20 bales of cloth or more to a customer. And you were doing that all day long, and he talks about how hard and what misery the work was, folding and unfolding, and what the long hours were. And there was also an issue about the drapers' status in society, because they were neither blue collar nor sort of the gentleman class. And so, oh sorry, I won't jump onto that. That's actually a map showing the scale of the Branscombe's draper's shop, and that's from 1887. And you can see the small drapery next door, but the extensive drapery showrooms, and of course there would have been the staff accommodation above. But the poor old draper, they were ridiculed, and unfortunately they were ridiculed largely because a lot of their customers were women. And so they were made to be quite effeminate. This is actually from Charles Dickens' Tales of Boz. I think it's a Cruikshank drawing. But there are lots of these cartoons depicting the draper as sort of, what do you call it, aspiring middle class or something, but really quite unpleasant about them. And so their status in society was a bit questionable. And there's a lot of references to that and more details in the book. But I'm going to move now to a key figure in the development of drapes, and that's Matthew Rose. Now, Matthew Rose was moved to the area in 1852 in a former draperies business. I've got to say, the draperies business were coming and going all the time. They were really subject to changes in fashion, changes in weather, and so they seemed to, I mean, when Alison was mapping all the drapers, so many of them went bust. And so there were always drapers moving into former drapers' shop. It was kept going on. In 1861, he had 12 staff living in. He then expanded in two further shops to form something called London House that I'll show you in a minute. By 1871, he had 28 staff living in, and just in case you wanted to know, there were 10 female assistants and 1 apprentice, 10 male assistants and 1 apprentice, a housekeeper, a cook, who would of course been looking after those staff, a clerk, 2 housemaids and a porter. The key moment came in 1877 to 1879, which I will explain. There's Matthew Rose's first department store. Now, this was just by the railway, by what was the Eight Bells Tavern and then became the Railway Tavern or something. That was just on that corner, and with Amherst Road down the side. And as you can see, it's quite a large shop in itself. But at that time, Church Street was extremely narrow. And there were carriages, and then there was the introduction of trams, and with the increase in traffic, it became untenable. And so there was a road widening programme, and oh dear, I made a mess of that. I thought that would be helpful, but it's not. Right, this is in 1877 to 9. You'll see just the yellow bit, which shows where there were a row of shops there up to the road, and they all got taken down in order to widen the road, and that included London House. And that actually benefited Matthew Rose because he had the compensation, etc., to go on to even bigger things. And in fact, if you're looking at old photos of Mare Street, a lot of people can't recognise the current street from the old because the road was so much narrower then, and they think it's the wrong street, but it wasn't. So we're moving into the era of the department stores. And here is Matthew Rose's department store in 1880. You can see on the right, which is the landmark you'll know now, which is the former bank, which is now, I think, Gales. And on this side of the road, this is where Marks and Spencer's is now. And he went from strength to strength. So, oh yes, sorry. He described himself as a silk mercer, a draper, and a carpet warehouseman. And so starting off from a very small number of staff, it grew and grew. This is one of his invoices from 1905. And interestingly, I can see Patrick there, this is an invoice from the Clapton Congregational Church, which is now the Round Chapel. They charge 10 shillings for beating a carpet. But if you look at the list of things that he says he's doing, he claims to be a general draper and complete house furniture. His furniture removed and warehoused. They're doing boots and shoes. They're doing family mourning. They're doing all goods marked in clear figures, which is a key change. And there's also the charge for beating the carpet. So you can see, I've got to say, every business seems to, whenever they do drawings of their business, whether it's a factory or shop, it's always about twice the size it actually was. But this was actually quite a large store. And the other thing you might just be able to see, there's little white balls, like little pearls, hanging down in front of the windows. And one of the key issues was how you lit these enormous stores. Because first of all, the original drapers were just oil lamps, so you could hardly see anything inside. And then it became gas lighting, but of course that created fumes and damaged the goods. So a lot of these early stores put the lighting on the outside, looking into the window, so illuminating from the outside. So that's why virtually all the photos I might show you, the department stores, all have those lights on the outside illuminating the window. So, by this time, when he had that big shop, he had 200 to 300 staff, and 90 were living in above the shop. So when you saw all those floors above, a lot of those were staff. And Matthew Rose had 24 different departments. So it was covering a lot of things, including furniture, as well as clothes and items, as well as all the stuff the drapers originally did. Rose was a great one for advertising. Some of them are quite comical. But he He advertised regularly, and the thing he claimed was he had the largest stock of goods in every department in North East London. And one of the big things that were popular about the department stores was that because they could bulk buy, they had a reputation for actually being cheap. They could underprice the individual drapers that were still trading at that time. But their sales were big business. And this is a quote from, I think this is the Shoreditch Observer at the top from 1895, talking about the sale at Matthew Rose and saying Monday will witness quite a reunion of mater familias in search of their yearly bargains. And you had reports of great big queues and things for the sales, even then. You can imagine Selfridges today. And the other thing about Matthew Rose, he was Hackney's largest ratepayer, and he certainly knew how to throw his weight around. So there's quite a lot of stories about him improving the roads around his particular shop to enable what they called the carriage trade. These shops were serving a very large area, much larger than Hackney. People used to come and shop there. And he became, he was obsessed with making sure people could park near his shop, like in Amherst Road. So he opposed the trams going down Amherst Road. And in this one, he was insisting that the road be improved with wooden blocks, which would have aided his traffic as well. So he had a very large advertising area, but so did the many other drapers, including Branscombe, who was still going at this time. And there was a sort of intense rivalry between them, and there was a sort of drapers' wars fought out through the newspapers, where they all said, we've got this coming in and we've got this new design, and they all fought each other, including about staff welfare and about who gave staff what time off. I've got to say that they've got quite a good reputation with staff, as far as you can see. The staff accommodation was quite essential, actually, especially to build up the staffing levels that you needed, because people were moving into Hackney from the country to work in these buildings. And by this time, there'd been a real change in the population. Women, for the first time, were able to travel because of the improvements in public transport, and they had the money to spend. There was much larger manufacture of goods, and there was a wider choice of goods. And there was greater spending power and aspirations amongst both the middle classes and the working classes. And window shopping actually became the new leisure pursuit. So their time had really come, and they'd taken off. There was one of the larger rivals, and I'm going to talk about two other department stores. This is Parnell. Now, James Parnell, he started off in 1891 as a draper's assistant in Pimlico, and he actually came to work for Matthew Rose and lived in 1899. So he was actually started off in Rose's in Hackney. By 1901, so within 2 years, he actually started his own department store. And this was where Peacock's is now, if people know the area now. And again, you can see it's a large department store. He gradually took over the shops neighbouring it until he spread across 4 shops. And you can see above, that was the staff accommodation. So he himself moved into Brett Road, which is just behind the store. And in 1911, he had 39 staff living in 42 rooms above the shop. And he did look after his staff. We actually talk, there's a quote from a woman whose grandmother had actually worked there. And at the time, if you got married and you're a woman, you were expected to leave work. You were expected to look after the home and the family. And she actually, in the First World War, needed to work. She didn't have the money. And he let her back into work on condition that she wore her wedding ring round her neck rather than on her finger, so it wasn't so obvious. But at that time, women really lost their jobs if they got married. But Parnell was obviously one who was willing to help people. Now, both Rose and Parnell closed between the wars. There was the Depression. They'd overextended in terms of their building, but also they become very old-fashioned. During that period in the war, there was real changes in the air, and they were described at the time by someone as the most boring shop in Hackney. Mind you, kids always say that. And the other, but there was one other department store, which is Spokes, which opened round the corner in Lower Clapton Road. And Henry Spokes, he opened up in 1894 and gradually one shop and gradually took over the whole row of shops. And so there you have his own heading there. I mean, it looks much more grandiose than it actually looks in the next photo, when you can actually see it in action. It's a joy to see the way some of them portray themselves. And again, there you can see those lights on the outside illuminating in. And Spokes lasted well after the Second World War. And I think there were two reasons. One, he was small in the first place, and so he didn't overextend in terms of size. But he also had a cash railway. Now, virtually every person, who ever went into Spokes as a child will talk about this cash railway. They talk about it like something out of Harry Potter. You used to put the money up, it used to whiz above your head, go to the cashier, who'd then come back with the change and the receipt. But kids would just stand there looking up. And I'm sure that meant actually the kids didn't find it as boring as the other shops. So I'm going to move on now to the 20th century. Oh, no, I'm not, sorry. This is poor old, what happened to Matthew Rose's. It got bombed during the war, and that's a photo of it being bombed. So moving to 20th century stores, Marks and Spencer's. Marks and Spencer's Penny Bazaar. This is one of the most fascinating things that I found out about when we were doing this work. Marks and Spencer's actually had 4 different locations in Mare Street. So in 1914, they opened a shop at 297 next to Ship Passage, and that was the Marks and Spencer's Penny Bazaar, where they sold everything, books, china, food, and the slogan was, don't ask the price, it's a penny. So that was in 1914. They then grew again, extended in 1919 to number 396. By 1930, they were here, which is, well, you'll know that building because it's so iconic. And that was one of their, again, that was another growth. And then in 1930, they built their own premises here, where they are today. And, I mean, that's a classic 30s building. When you look at it, you look up, because you'll see, I mean, that's Grittle windows. I think they might have changed the windows, but otherwise it's there. And in 1971, they extended at the corner, so you'll see the edge which took it into Amherst Road. At the time, they were mainly known at this stage for clothes. And as you all know, they were most famous for knickers. But in 1988, they changed predominantly to food, and that's probably the M&S that we know today. I've got to say the M&S archives were wonderful at giving the information. There's a lot more in the book that they provided us with. British Home Stores opened just literally down the road in the old Parnell building, and lots of people remember that, mainly for its lighting. But it was always seen as slightly cheaper than M&S, and it also had a restaurant that seemed to be very popular. So I've just briefly referred to that. Of course, when it had to close when the scandal erupted as someone who ripped the company off in true fashion. Anyway, so I'm now going to move to Woolies. Lovely Woolies. Yeah, actually, it's said in there, you never hear people moaning about Woolies. All you hear is people who miss it and loved it. And everyone who worked there, who shopped there, remembers Woolies. And there's just a reminder of some of the stock, the amazing products you can get in there. Unfortunately, you also hear from a great deal of people including someone in the audience who I won't look at, who talked about nicking stuff from Woolworths. It was the favourite. In fact, someone said to me, oh, that was the free makeup shop. Everyone talks about pick and mix. More went in the mouth than they went in the bag, etc., etc. So, I mean, you do wonder whether that was because the poor sods closed. But it was a truly wonderful company. And people, it was extremely popular and still has a place in people's hearts. And there it is. That's in about 1980, that photo. And you can see again, built 1930, you can see the design in the building that's still there. And in fact, that facade there's nothing behind the top bit, the parapet. There's a photo in the book that shows it's blank behind. Furniture. So, at one time, furniture was made locally and sold locally. Unless, of course, you had no money, and then furniture was often scratch-built by people in their own homes. And this is Richard Hutchinson, who was a furniture maker and trader opposite the Cock Tavern. And when he died, we were looking at his list of possessions that went to auction records. Are fantastic at telling you what people had. And you'll see the sort of furniture that had been sold in 1808, four-poster beds, tent beds, clean season feather beds, mattresses, fine blankets, oilcloth carpets, hearth rugs, secretaire, bookcases, chest of drawers, dining card and Pembroke tables, wash-hand stands, sofas, chairs, pier glasses that were mirrors, and also a two-wheel truck, axle wheels and springs to light cart, which he no doubt used to deliver goods. So that was the sort of furniture trade in those days, and that was someone who actually had a shop. But of course, Shoreditch, well, the south of Hackney now, as we know now, was the centre of furniture making. So it is little wonder that big furniture shops to sell the goods arrived in Mare Street. And this is the cover of the book, but this is the full photo, this is the full postcard that the cover was taken from. This is Hackney Furniture Company. Now, Hackney Furniture Company was set up in 1880, that on the Iceland, what's now the Iceland site, by Alfred Siegenberg, who moved from Whitechapel to form his company. And it became the largest furniture store in East London. And it started off as a showrooms here, but it just grew and grew. It moved to very large premises by the town hall, and it also had 4 other buildings around Hackney. So it really quite dominated Hackney south of the railway bridge. And one of the things that they realised is people had aspirations by then. They had a bit of money, work was coming in. People had aspirations for both clothes but also for furniture, but they didn't have the ready cash. And so they introduced schemes, and one of the pioneers of what we'd now probably call hire purchase was Hackney Furnishing Company. And they produced, and I'll go on to it, they produced a buy now, pay later scheme, and lots of people would call it TIC or the never never. But at the time, the Hackney Furnishing Company's shilling credit business, for a shilling a week, over 100 weeks, you could furnish a home for £5. They didn't charge interest, but they would all give a discount 20% for prompt cash. So in a way, you were paying through the goods. And that really built up the business, because suddenly people could afford things they hadn't been able to afford before. And that became really important. Hackney Furnishing Company ended up with over 5 acres of showrooms in Hackney. They sold everything from 4-poster beds to mangles, and they produced a huge catalogue. Now, this is their invoice, and again, you can see the 4 buildings, including the big one that was next to Hackney Town Hall, just to the south of Hackney Town Hall. I'm not sure what it is now. Oh, it's the library. Sorry, whoops. That was the one on the corner there, you can see. It was a very large undertaking. And there's a picture of what it used to look like from their catalogue. Again, they were another one that liked to show their thing. And I think that probably might be a Rolls Royce they parked outside just to reinforce the aspirational side. That is a page from their catalogue. 5 minutes, right, okay, I've got to speed. They opened a shop in Mare Street, in Oxford Street. It's still there today, but they overstretched themselves 1830 and went bust. I'm going to zip through, oh, that's Smart. There was a similar chain that came to Hackney. And that's lovely Gibbons. There's so many articles in the shop. And one of the things about Gibbons, it was actually run by Elizabeth Gibbons, a woman, and her sons. And then Times Furnishing came in 1974, and that's a 1974 picture, they were there before. And they brought that whole new ethos of teak furniture, G-plan, etc., again, which was all paid for on the Never Never. So I'm just going to give 2 items of clothing, one for the ladies, corsets, damn them. There you see in the middle, you'll see the corset shop, that's Jacob Rosenbaum and Son. It was 2 men running it, as was common. This is Mr. Orff, who actually provided bridal corsets, the mind boggles, corsets for dancing and riding. And there was a lovely woman who was a corsetier called Kitty Goldstein, who I'm really fond of because she seems to be the only woman who was doing it. But of course, the big change was 1930s when elasticated fabrics came in, and you got the girdle, which was meant to be a lot more comfortable, and it was relatively, but for people who used to wear them, they were bloody torture. And let's torture the men for a minute. This was Miss Boobs. Sorry, I will torture them in a minute. This is Miss Boobs. This represents the new freedoms that arrived in the 70s when women threw away their girdles. And that's in Kitty Goldstein's old where her shop was located. The men had to wear collars. And if you were lucky, they were linen. If you were unlucky, they were celluloid plastic and made you sweat like hell. And this was Fowler and Piggin, who were in Mare Street. And the wonderful thing about Mr. Piggin, he was prosecuted for selling linen collars that weren't linen. And he said, what did they expect? You can't get a decent linen collar for 5 shillings or whatever. So he was pretty unapologetic. This is Mr. Rawson, who really represents a change in the class population of Hackney, because he was making specialty white shirts to give extra stout long cloths for hard wear. And he also specialised, he said, I am noted for the best working men's best working men's shirts in Hackney. So this really does begin to represent the change in population, and they didn't have to have collars when they were working, thank God. Shoemakers. Early shoemakers, you can see the apprentice in the background, they made shoes straight, so they didn't have left and right foot. And they were often made in cloth. We found one clog maker in Hackney, which is pretty astonishing. We're not clear what working class men wore on their feet. But 1831, there were 11 shoemakers in Hackney. By 1970s, there were 9 shoe shops, and machine production had arrived. This is machine production. The first shop to sell machine-produced foods was Lillian Skinner's, where I've put the arrow. And I'm just going to jump to the next slide. This is a then. In the next one now, you'll see that shoe sewn was more or less where Lillian Skinner's was. And in fact, Hackney continued to have shoe shops for a mecca for shoes for a very long time. I'm going to have to what everyone remembers, the X-ray machines. They were actually found to be unhealthy after they poisoned or whatever several children's feet. But the children, of course, loved going to all the shoe shops had them, including Spokes department store had them. I'm not going to dwell much on food, I'm just going to zip through it. Started off field to fork. There's a milkmaid, there's cows, there's hay. Hackney was famous for its milk and its cows. Corn chandlers sold grain. I love this one. This is from 1885, and you'll see that the corn chandler, Frederick Bax, actually was running a vegetarian restaurant. So for those who think they've just discovered it, tough. This is bakers. Used to be really, really hard work, and baker shops used to be baker shops for a long time because, of course, the ovens were needed. So they tended to go from one baker to another rather than other stores. And that's a Percy Ingles bread-making machine, Percy Ingles' grandfather's machine. Butchers, that's what it used to look like on the left, and I can barely look at it. You used to walk through a pool of blood to get in. And on the right, you can see eventually, finally, they started doing a bit of hygiene around butchery. Fishmongers, I wish I had more time. Sarah Cheetham was one of the few female traders in Hackney. And she was a very interesting woman. And in her will, she left money to bring up her granddaughter. And if her granddaughter died before, it was to go to her daughter, to her own separate use without any control of her husband. And she signed her will with a cross. Next door, shellfish stall, there were stalls along Mare Street. I was really surprised to find quite substantial evidence for presence of market stalls all the way along, which are in the book. Then there were tea sellers. This is a lovely cartoon advert we found advertising Atlas Tea House, a tea warehouse in Hackney. And there's another one that's also a grocer's. You've got the early grocers. They were the elite of the professionals because they actually had to grind and roast and cure everything themselves. So it was a real skill. And then you started getting chain stores moving in. So this is dairies, Maypole Dairy and Perk stores moved in. And they more or less started the grocers selling a wide range of things, including perfecting the art of margarine. So you've got them to blame for that. And then we got Sainsbury's. This is Sainsbury's design for, I think it's 1930. I'll find it very quickly in a minute. I've probably got about 2 minutes left, haven't I? Sainsbury's moved in 1929. That's now the Santander site. And you'll see there was accommodation at the top for staff to live even then. And there's a familiar sign of when prices felt cheaper, but they might not have done at the time. There's a lovely view of the window with all the meat in it, and they say it smelled of a lovely old butcher's when you went in. And then you had Tesco's arriving in the development of self-service, and there's Tesco in the old pub at the top in Dalston Lane. I'm going to skip through sorry. How can you resist it? You've got mentioning Tesco's, you've got to talk about grease your stamps. And that was Sainsbury's explaining to people how to... Sainsbury's explained to people how to do self-service. Now, of course, that's a historical artefact. Eating out. There were restaurants. There's Dinmore's coffee rooms, just next to where the St Augustine's Tower is. And there's the coffee and dining rooms, and that's what they were eating. This is in the book. So we've managed to zoom in and find out what was actually on the menu in that shop. And it include cooked jam and gooseberry or fig roll and cabbage a shilling. Anyway, okay. So I'm going to finish with, there was a Lions Tea Rooms, an ABC, a Wimpy Bar, McDonald's, which I won't even talk about. And just to come to a conclusion, just look up. Now, this building in particular is very identifiable, and it started off as fish pawnbrokers on that site in 1841. It then was Branscombe's Linen Drapers. It then became Hackney Picture Palace, which it is there. It then became London Provincial Temperance Billiard Halls and another billiard hall. Then it was Marks and Spencer's. Then it was J&F Stone Lighting and Radio. Then it became Rumbelows, and now it's JD Sports. So you've got a fantastic history just in that building. So look up at the building. I'm going to finish up with our favourite quirks. We love it, don't we, when we find the names of people that suit them. So this is Mr. Clogg, who of course had to sell shoes, didn't he, in boots. And these are three. The top one, it shows a reference to a gardener but applied to Mr. Mould, the cheesemonger. Then you had a wonderful shop called Tuck, who was a pastry cook. And then, very fond one, Mr. Belcher, who was the chemist. So I think I'm going to finish on that, last one. I mean, what more can you say? Nothing changes. There was recycling then, there's recycling now. This man had the most fantastic advert. There's a bit about him in the book, and the things that he was doing, promoting it, and wonderful uses of those objects, which I've also included. So I'm going to finish now and just hold up the book. Buy a copy now from the Hackney Society bookshop, and we will sign it. And thank you for any questions.